the Morrison government has reached an in-principle agreement with the French shipbuilder Naval Group, guaranteeing 60% spending in Australia throughout the construction of the 12 attack-class submarines. The deal follows a visit to Australia by the Naval Group CEO and successive phone conversations between our PM and the French President Emmanuel Macron. To discuss this and more, I'm joined now from Melbourne by the foreign editor of The Australian, Mr Greg Sheridan. Greg, I wanted you on the back of your story in The Australian today. Explain to viewers, we've talked a fair bit about submarines here on the show, what is in this new agreement and why it's a better deal for Australia? Because I thought we were supposed to have local content from the outset, but clearly we were told we had one deal, but we didn't have it until perhaps today.
Well, Peter, it's great to be with you, and you know, it's fantastic that you're taking an interest in this story. I wish the government would do more to publicise this. This is really a good news story. I mean, I am alone amongst centre-right commentators in thinking these submarines are the best submarines we could possibly get, and the price for them is entirely reasonable. If you decide you're going to build 12 cutting-edge, world-class technology submarines in Australia, it's going to cost you a lot of money. You're going to have to build shipyards. You're going to have to spend an enormous amount of money on the American weapons system. You're going to have to spend a lot of money on submarine design. Now, the French commitment is that over the life of the 12 submarines, 60% of the money will be spent in Australia. Now, given how thoroughly Australia has denuded itself of all manufacturing industry, that is a miraculous and heroic commitment by the French. But what this new agreement does is it stipulates that you don't just get to the end of the 12 submarines and then look back and say, well, can we calculate that 60% was spent in Australia? What you do is, at every phase of work, you have an agreed band of Australian content. And if the French fall below that band, they pay penalties. And if the Australian content goes above that band, they qualify for incentives. Now, it won't be 60% on the first submarine. That's just not possible. There simply isn't the industry in Australia. We've spent 3 generations wiping out all manufacturing in Australia, so we simply don't have the industry to do 60% of a submarine on the first submarine. But it will be very substantial. There'll be a lot of Australian work in the propulsion system, in the electronic systems, and of course a huge element of the cost is the American combat system. So that will be predominantly American work.
Just on that point, Greg, how confident are you, given the issues with the French and the American, the best of times, how confident are you that if you've got the boat shell coming from the French, albeit progressively built in Australia, and you've got the internals, you know, the sinews and the muscles and the blood, let's call it, of the submarine's organ coming from the American, how confident are you that these two can be put together in a way that gives us the boat we've been promised?
Well, you know, every new weapon system causes some trouble. So the Navy, of course, wanted cutting-edge capabilities. But, Peter, I'm so much older than you, but I don't know if you're old enough to remember the controversy that surrounded the F-111 aircraft when it came into service, and yet it turned out to be, people ridiculed it, what a joke it was, and yet it turned out to be the backbone of our Air Force. Now, the sinews of the submarine will predominantly be French. The one thing that'll be American is the combat system. Now, what did we have in the competitive tender process? We had Germans, Japanese and French. The Japanese didn't give us the best Soryu class sub that they have themselves. They gave us a clearly inferior bid, and sadly they were ruled out, even though I was backing them on strategic grounds. The Germans certainly are no better than the French. The Germans don't build subs as big as this. So if we want subs, we're going to have to get them from somewhere. The Americans don't build conventional subs, so we couldn't get an American combat system and an American...
So there's the test. Should we, and is it too late, but should we have a parallel operation here in Australia, should this French build fall over, should we seriously have on the table consideration of a nuclear option?
There are 2 problems here, Peter. First of all, the French build won't fall over unless we kick it to death or something. This Naval Group is one of the great shipbuilding companies in the world. They make nuclear submarines, which are much more complicated than the one we're making, for the French Navy. I mean, they're not a joke company. You know, there's no reason to think it'll fall over unless we decide that we don't want it for some reason. And I think the government is sinfully culpable in not arguing the case for this submarine. Almost everything you hear about this submarine is nonsense and is science fiction. And then the second question, the nuclear subs. Well, the centre-right side of politics has been unable over the last 4 decades even to provide a single site in Australia where we can store the nuclear waste that we generate from our medical laboratories in a couple of hospitals. What makes us think that with a parliamentary majority of 0 and the two-party preferred vote constantly on 50-50, they can overcome all the anti-nuclear politics of Australia in order to introduce a nuclear weapons system into Australia when we can't even get a nuclear fuel, a nuclear waste disposal?
No. You and I know that's a lack of that's a lack of leadership, to be honest.
It sure is, but it's also a reality. We have to have submarines.
I accept that.
We can't wait until our politics is revolutionised before we get a submarine.
I agree with that, but we also need leaders who are prepared to have these conversations and debates with the Australian people, because right now we always get the worse off option because we haven't got leaders prepared to tackle those sorts of fights. Just quickly, I'm really interested for your take on this declassification over the weekend of the CIA report into the Saudi Prince Mohammed bin Salman over the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi in Turkey. Extraordinary that the report is out. What's it going to do to the relationships, and will much change from here on in?
I don't know why the Biden administration released this report. It's been very clear that that MBS was involved in this. The Saudis are a very unlikable regime, but they are by no means the worst regime in the Middle East. And strategically, they are on our side. They are the enemies of our enemies. They are the enemies of the Iranians. The Iranians are racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour towards nuclear weapons and are the chief threat in the Middle East. The Saudis have been following, by their standards, relatively enlightened policies in a lot of areas lately. The murder of Khashoggi, of course, was a shocking, terrible human rights violation, but the Saudis have been slightly liberalising their society, and they have been cooperating with the United States and with Australia in the counter-terrorism war and in the normalisation of relations with Israel, which massively reduces tensions in the Middle East. But the Biden administration, in the Middle East at least, seems to want to do exactly the reverse of everything that Trump did. And in the Middle East, Trump was successful. I have a lot of criticisms of Trump, but all those peace agreements we got between Israel and the Gulf Arab states, the Gulf Arab states lining up behind American leadership to resist Iran, that's a tremendous Trump success. Biden might blow this all away without any benefit. I can't quite understand what Biden's game plan is here, what he thinks he's going to get out of it.
Yeah, well, we'll watch it. It may emerge, but you'll certainly give us analysis if it does. Greg Sheridan, thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Peter.